Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the new Pornographers and their newest album, Whiteout Conditions. So I've talked a little bit about supergroups before, the music fans' dream collaborations that more often than not never quite lives up to the expectations. But of course, it's not always the case, and considering how much I like the champion Canadian music, it's a damn tragedy it's taken me so very long to talk about this group. So, the new Pornographers. Born out of the Vancouver indie rock scene around the turn of the millennium, many of the members had prominent roles in their own groups and side projects before coming together for this. And looking back now, it's almost a little bit astounding how well it turned out. Carl Newman was widely held as the primary songwriter and band leader, but when you surround him with acts that would prove to become songwriting powerhouses in their own right, like Nico Case and Dan Bejar of Destroyer, and a host of other 90s Canadian indie veterans, that lineup was almost too good to fail, and that's saying a lot. And sure enough, for the first half of the 2000s, the new Pornographers made some of the catchiest and most infectious power pop and indie rock that you would hear outside of the mainstream, getting a ton of very well-deserved critical acclaim. Those albums are awesome. Yeah, things did kind of slip with Challengers and Together that came along later in the decade, but they were able to yank things back in with Brill Bruisers in 2014, a record that I really wish I could have covered 3 years ago, cranking up the synthesizer lines and creating a project that didn't quite feel as backwards looking or occasionally indulgent as earlier records could occasionally wall into. And while I was excited to hear that they were going to push even further down that new wave path on Whiteout Conditions, I'm not going to deny I was a little bit concerned to hear that Dan Bejar of Destroyer was not contributing to this album. Apparently he's been hard at work on that next Destroyer album, kind of awesome, but in terms of songwriting, and this is no disrespect to Newman, Dan Bejar is in a class of his own, and I was kind of concerned what his absence could mean for the new album. But hey, it was bound to be energetic, bound to be pretty fun, right? So even if I am months late to the punch here, I know it's Patreon scheduling, it happens. What did we get with Whiteout Conditions? Honestly, while I do like this album, and I do think that it is a solid enough entry into the new Pornographers discography, I'm also not going to deny that I do feel a little bit distant from it. Comfortable in calling it a very good album thanks to the few infectious choruses and the solid chemistry that has held forth for the supergroup for over a decade now, but missing Dan Bejar and throughout the choice of some of these themes, it's hard not to feel like the new Pornographers just aren't manufacturing at least some distance from their audience, and a core sound that kind of flies in the face of that thematic contrast. It's a good record for sure, but I wish I could like it more. But okay, before we get into all of that, we need to talk about the core of the group that I still like. And yes, while I do miss the weirder flights of fantasy from Bejar's writing, the interweaving vocal harmonies and melodic grooves, they are still very much here, all at the faster BPM that make the new Pornographers actually stand out against the rest of modern indie rock that draws upon slick mid-80s new wave tones, as so many of them often do. And this album does so much more than most. Percussion here is a little bit more programmed, although there's nearly always real drums and it's never obtrusive. The synths, they've got the same sort of chill swell that touched a lot of that era. The bass grooves, they're here, but not quite as choppy as the early years of new wave, which does give this some sort of anthemic swell, and especially when you get tones like the broad color of the main guitars on high-ticket attractions, or the gentle fizz behind Darling Shade, it's a pretty obvious callback to that era of the 80s. But the technicolor tones, and especially the faster beats, also call to mind the dance-inflected electronic rock that came around the turn of the millennium in the late 90s and very early 2000s, especially with the choppy vocal layering on Second Sleep, the inflection of some brighter acoustic lines against the grinding bass of Colosseums, the warping shifts in the guitar around Clockwise, that main acoustic group behind Avalanche Alley, or especially that echoing vocal effect on Juke that honestly probably tested my patience the most in this album. I do think that's probably the weakest track here. And look, when this album hits a truly golden hook, the title track, the ballad We Were Been Here Before, they're by far the best songs here, although there are several hooks that will stick out for you. But I gotta say, there's a part of me that feels like all that slick polish is taking away some of that ramshackle momentum that has always been a great selling point for the new Pornographers on their earliest work. And it's not like these tones are not so well trod ground by this point, especially as, despite the guitars having some jangling presence to them, they actually stick out in the mix for being a little bit more staccato, have a little bit of bite bite to them, they don't quite have the same bruising muscle or power as they could. But of course, that polish, it's part of the point. And that means we're gonna have to get into the content and go in deep. And as always, the new Pornographers songs are a little bit tough to decode. I may have gotten these wrong, just you're forewarned here, but you can almost tell that the band is intentionally not making it easy for their audience, with a few references that some diehard fans will get, but some lines almost come across as closed loops, almost a little bit standoffish. Only the band would understand them. And right from the very first song, Play Money, can almost come across as kind of cynical. Not quite going through the motions or weary or tired, but almost calculated or mercenary. When previous members of the band have described the new Pornographers as a bit of a vacation for them, more of that sort of side project, why does it now seem like so much work on some of these songs? But then you quickly realize that detachment and artifice, punching the clock there, it's not just a feature, it's the thematic core of the album. Industry veterans that are staying out in the landscape where the earnestness isn't quite there in their hearts in the same way, and sometimes you need to take a step back if only just to stay sane. And of course, they aren't just referring to themselves. High-ticket attractions might be the most overt reference to anxiety in the wake of an upcoming election, as it was written back in 2016. But then you have Darling Shade, which has got a sardonic contempt for mainstream media's fumbling and enabling of populist movements that rapidly get out of their control. Or This Is the World of the Theater, which is about exactly what you think it is. And it's all about that manufactured image and how little power that it ultimately will have. They don't deny the comfort in such a veneer. Colosseums and Second Sleep, they're pretty explicitly about how said deflections can provide some peace of mind for the ego at least. But they're also smart enough in that final third of the album to peel things back a little bit and show that sort of projected ego on Clockwise can lead to some people overcompensating. And on songs like Avalanche Alley, it shows just how useless all that will be in the face of real problems that need to be addressed before it's too late. You can't just project ego and forget that they were even there, especially if they've all been here before and you couldn't find the solutions to it last time and you need them now. So on some level, yeah, it's a pretty damn cynical record, and the sort that doesn't hesitate at all to include the band in that framing, which can make for a pretty harrowing listen if you really think about it, and you've already been overthinking about the blend of projected self-image and artifice and the weirdness of modern life. I may have been watching and overthinking entirely too much vlog content over the past couple days. I ranted about it on Twitter. The point is, really, the new Pornographers, they're perfectly poised to make this sort of detached commentary, especially as a Canadian group looking south, and yet all the more conscious of what could actually happen up here if we're not careful. But this is where the writing hits the actual execution and the tone, because while the late 90s did have some self-conscious veneer of ironic detachment in this style of indie rock, the other tones pulled more from the mid-80s, they didn't really. In terms of socially aware or political music, a lot of that was more earnest in that time period. And this album might have power and precision after you decode it, but the fact that you actually have to decode it and it still feels as guarded as it is can be a weird juxtaposition with a lot of these established tones. And it really doesn't help it feel all that populist, which given the big sing-along hooks that the new Pornographers have, it can feel even more discombobulating for me. Maybe that's the root of why I'm not really connecting with this record more. An album intended to step back and detach for a moment of personal respite, conscious that eventually, yes, you're gonna need to rejoin the fray when the veneers all collapse and things get a lot worse, and maybe just succeeds too well and mute some of that emotional response. I can appreciate it more than I outright love it. Or maybe I'm just overthinking all this and it's merely a pretty good new Pornographers record where I was hoping for greatness because the hooks just aren't there in the same way. I don't know. Anyway, look, I did like this, but I do find myself wishing that I liked it a lot more. I appreciate the big ideas and themes at the core. Again, and the new Pornographers, they write ridiculously catchy hooks, but I don't think this is a set of some of their best hooks, and Dan Bejar not being here does mean some of that added spark of weirdness and real emotional heft doesn't quite pass through in the same way. As such, for me, light 7 out of 10, recommendation, but it's not their best. And I recommend checking out their early to mid-2000s work if you haven't heard them before and you really want to get a handle on this group at their prime peak. In the meantime, though, again, I'm really late to covering this album, I know, but I can't deny that there's a lot to like about it, so if you're curious, check it out. You won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know, I am late to the punch with this. That's what happens when you get Patreon, though. You guys vote on the schedule, it just takes a little bit of time to get to it, and yes, I finally did. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys actually heard the album, polls up there, how would you guys rate it? And if you want to buy it, if you're curious, links in the description below. Beyond that, anything else I might... Well, I already said that. If you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process so I can cover records like this a couple months ago when they first drop, links to my Patreon right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add a record to my schedule or even a movie if you're in the higher tiers. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.